In the quiet countryside of Vermont in 1920, there stood a house that people crossed the road to avoid. Its tall, sagging frame leaned slightly to the left as if it were tired of standing. The windows were clouded with decades of dust, and ivy crept up its sides like veins spreading through a dying body. Locals said that even the wind changed direction when it reached the old Merriman House. For 70 years, it had sat untouched, abandoned after the last owner disappeared one night without a word. Time had eaten through the paint, through the roof, through the story that once lived there. And by the spring of that year, the house had become more than just a memory. It was a warning whispered to children and a mystery that grown men didn't dare touch. Then came the three men who didn't believe in warnings. They were not the kind to be frightened by old stories. Frank Dillard, the oldest of the three, was a war veteran who had returned home with scars that didn't show. He'd seen death up close and often said that nothing left on this earth could scare him. His brother-in-law, Tom Avery, was younger and hungrier. He worked odd jobs, fixing barns, hauling lumber, anything that paid enough to keep his small family fed. The third man, Eddie Malone, was the dreamer of the group. A wiry man in his early 30s with a kind face and too much curiosity for his own good. He wasn't looking for money. He wanted a story, something to tell that would make people listen. When the town council announced that they wanted the old Merriman property cleared and made safe for sale, the three men saw an opportunity. The council offered $20 for the job, good money in 1920, especially for a few days of cleaning. It was supposed to be simple. Remove debris, patch the roof, clear the mold, and make sure the floors don't collapse underfoot. They took the job without hesitation. The hoe. Essie stood at the edge of Black Creek Road, surrounded by fields that hadn't grown anything in decades. The grass was tall enough to hide small animals, and the trees nearby leaned toward the house as if listening. The men arrived early one morning, the fog still clinging to the ground. Their boots sank slightly into the soft earth as they walked up the narrow path. Tom whistled low when he saw the place up close. "Looks like it's been dead a long time," he said, half joking. Frank didn't answer. He was staring at the porch where the boards sagged inward, darkened with rot. Eddie was the first to step up and push open the front door. It creaked like something alive, and a faint smell drifted out. Damp wood, old fabric, and something else beneath it. Something sharp like rust and decay. Inside, the air was thick and cold. Light barely reached through the stained windows, cutting the room into long shadows. Furniture stood where it had been left decades ago. A rocking chair near the fireplace, a broken lamp, a table with a single glass still resting on it. Dust lay over everything like snow. A portrait hung above the mantel. A man and a woman dressed in fine clothes, unsmiling, their eyes painted with strange precision. Someone had tried to scratch out the woman's face. "Creepy," Eddie muttered, brushing dust off the table. His voice echoed in the silence, too loud. They started working without much talk. Frank began inspecting the structure, testing beams and walls for strength. Tom carried out broken planks and old curtains. Eddie took to cleaning the parlor, carefully moving objects around as if they might break from being touched. Every once in a while, he found small things that made him stop. A child's shoe under a chair, a cracked teacup with lipstick still faintly visible, a clock stuck at 3:17. The house felt frozen in the moment it had been abandoned, as though time itself had stopped here and refused to move on. By afternoon, the men took a break outside. The sun had risen high, but the house still cast an unnatural chill. Frank sat on the porch steps, rolling a cigarette. "You know," he said quietly, "they say the last owner, Henry Merriman, wasn't right in the head. His wife and 2 kids vanished one night, and he hung himself a week later. Folks said he buried something out back first." Tom frowned. "You believe that?" Frank shrugged. "Don't need to believe it. Just telling you what people say." Eddie, sitting nearby, looked toward the back of the property where the grass grew higher. "If he buried something, maybe we'll find it," he said with a grin, trying to sound lighthearted. But his voice cracked slightly. The house had a way of getting under your skin. That night, after they left, the town seemed quieter than usual. Even the tavern where they met for dinner was hushed when Eddie mentioned the job. The bartender stopped wiping glasses for a moment and said, "You're working on the Merriman place?" He spoke the name softly, like it was bad luck to say too loudly. "You boys should leave that house alone. Some things don't want to be disturbed." They laughed it off, but each of them slept uneasily. Frank dreamed of the portrait on the wall, the woman's half-scratched face staring back at him. Tom woke in the middle of the night to the sound of his own footsteps echoing in his head, as though he were walking through that dark hallway again. And Eddie, though he didn't admit it, couldn't shake the feeling that the smell in the house, the faint metallic tang, had followed him home. The next morning, they returned. The fog was thicker, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Something about the house looked different, though none of them could say what. The door they'd left open was now closed. A faint handprint marked the glass of the front window, smeared from the inside, and as they stood there, uncertain, Frank finally said what none of them wanted to. "Let's just get it done. The sooner we finish, the better." They didn't know it yet, but the house they were about to step into had been waiting. It had waited 70 years for someone to open its doors again, and now that they had, it wasn't going to let them leave without remembering what had been buried there long ago. The second day inside the Merriman house felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted them. The men arrived early, tools in hand, their laughter quieter than usual. The mood that morning was different, less about the money now, and more about something unspoken between them and the house. The longer they stayed, the more the place seemed to watch them. The floors creaked even when no one moved, the wallpaper shifted slightly in the corners, and the faint sound of dripping, though there was no leak, echoed through the halls. Frank was the first to notice the smell had grown stronger overnight. "It's not just rot," he said, his voice low. "Smells like iron. Like blood." The others brushed it off, but uneasily. They were used to bad odors in old houses, mold, animal nests, damp wood. But this was different. It had a thickness to it, a metallic edge that caught in their throats. They divided their work again. Tom to the back rooms, Frank to the upper floor, and Eddie in the parlor. The silence between them grew through the day, broken only by the sound of boots and scraping wood. Eddie kept wandering from his task, drawn to things that didn't quite fit. The small locked door under the stairs, the way one wall in the dining room sounded hollow when he knocked. Around noon, he found something odd. In the corner of the parlor, behind an old cabinet, the wallpaper was peeled just enough to show a pattern underneath. Faded lines drawn directly on the wall. At first, he thought it was childish doodling, but when he looked closer, he realized there were symbols, circles, crosses, and words written in something dark. He called the others. Frank stared at the wall for a long time before saying, "Someone was trying to keep something out, or in." His tone carried no humor. Tom tried to make sense of it, touching one of the lines with his finger. "It's probably old. Kids' drawings or something." Eddie shook his head. Kids don't write in Latin. The discovery unsettled all three, but Frank insisted they ignore it. He wasn't a man who liked superstitions. He fought through real nightmares overseas and didn't believe in ghosts. Still, his hands trembled slightly when he turned away from that wall. That evening, as they packed up to leave, Tom mentioned he'd found something behind the pantry, a small wooden box buried beneath broken jars. Inside were pieces of jewelry, a ring with initials carved into it, and what looked like a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon. "Probably belonged to the family," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Frank told him to leave it there, but Eddie argued they could show it to the council, maybe get a bonus for returning lost property. The argument grew sharper than it should have. Frank shouted first. Tom snapped back, and, for the first time, Eddie saw something in Frank's eyes, a flash of something cold and tired by the third day. The tension among them had started to show. The house wasn't just dirty anymore. It was changing them. Frank, who had always been the calm one, grew short-tempered. Tom, usually quiet, started snapping at small things. Eddie couldn't stop talking about the Merriman family. He'd started asking questions around town in the evenings, collecting rumors, piecing together the story. He learned that Henry Merriman was once a respected doctor, though not one people spoke kindly of. They said he became obsessed with preserving life, experimenting with ways to cheat death after his wife fell ill. Some said he practiced strange rituals, borrowing from old medical texts and forbidden prayers. Others whispered that his children were never seen outside after a certain year. When Eddie brought this up to the others the next morning, Frank told him to shut it. "You keep digging, you'll find something you don't want to," he said. But Eddie couldn't stop. The story had its claws in him now. That same day, something strange happened upstairs. Frank had gone to repair a broken beam in the hallway when he heard a sound behind him, a soft tapping, like footsteps on the floorboards. When he turned, there was nothing there. But on the wall beside him, fresh dust had fallen in the shape of a small handprint. He stood there for a long moment, staring, before quietly backing away. Meanwhile, Tom had begun working near the cellar. He said it was colder there than anywhere else in the house, even though it was late spring. When he pulled open the door, a rush of air came out so cold it fogged his breath. He only lasted a few minutes inside before he came back out pale-faced. "There's something down there," he whispered. "A smell worse than upstairs. Eddie wanted to check it out, but Fr. Hank forbade it. We came a clean, not to go digging into graves," he said. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed him. He was scared, though he wouldn't admit it. That night, as they packed to leave, Tom mentioned hearing something while working, a low hum, like someone whispering far away. Eddie said he heard it too, but higher-pitched, almost like singing. Frank didn't respond. He just said, "We finish tomorrow, no matter what." But no matter what had already begun. By morning, Tom didn't show up on time. Eddie and Frank waited nearly an hour before deciding to start without him. The sky was overcast, and the air hung heavy with humidity. Inside, it was darker than usual, like the light itself refused to enter. They were halfway through clearing the upper floor when they heard the back door slam shut. Frank ran downstairs, thinking it was the wind, but stopped cold when he saw Tom standing there, covered in dirt, breathing hard. His hand shook as he held something wrapped in a piece of cloth. "I went early," Tom said, voice trembling. "I wanted to see what was in the cellar." He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small, rusted tin box. The air in the room seemed to thicken when he opened it. Inside were several yellowed papers, tied together with twine, and something small and black, a piece of bone. Eddie leaned closer, frowning. "That's human," he said quietly. Frank grabbed the box and threw it shut. "We're done. We're not touching this." But it was already too late. The smell filled the room again, sharper than before, stinging their noses. The floorboards creaked beneath them, though no one moved. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed shut. From that moment, something inside each of them shifted. Eddie started hearing things, the sound of children laughing faintly in the halls. Tom began talking in circles, saying the name Clara under his breath, though none of them knew who that was. And Frank, the strong one, started drinking again after years of staying clean. That'd be why the end of that day. None of them trusted each other anymore. Tom thought Eddie had taken one of the papers from the box. Eddie thought Frank wanted to keep everything quiet to claim more of the payment. Frank believed both of them were lying. They began snapping at each other over nothing. Who took a break too long? Who moved a tool? Who made the house worse? The town noticed their change too. Eddie's wife said he'd started talking in his sleep. Tom's hand shook so badly that he dropped his tools. Frank barely spoke at all. On the fifth day, the breaking point came. Eddie, restless and obsessed, returned alone at dawn. He had to know what was buried under the cellar floor. He brought a lantern and a small shovel. The earth was soft there, damp and black. He dug for nearly an hour before he hit something hard, a piece of wood. He brushed it off carefully, realizing it wasn't a floorboard. It was a box. When he opened it, the lantern flickered. Inside lay small bones, neatly arranged, wrapped in what had once been a white cloth. A child's toy, an old wooden horse, sat on top. Eddie froze, his breath shallow. The house groaned as if sighing, and from somewhere in the darkness behind him, he thought he heard a voice whisper his name. By the time Frank and Tom found him hours later, Eddie was sitting on the cellar floor, staring blankly. He didn't speak when they asked what happened. He just pointed at the hole. Frank covered it without a word. Tom threw up outside. None of them mentioned it again, but the silence between them was different now, heavy and cruel. The job no longer mattered. They should have left then. But greed, pride, and something darker kept them coming back. The house had them now. One, Eddie, once the curious one, became quiet and pale, carrying the little wooden horse in his coat pocket wherever he went. They didn't know it yet, but the real horror hadn't begun. What they dug up wasn't just bones. It was a story the house had kept buried for 70 years. And now, like the dust they'd stirred from its walls, it was beginning to rise again. The sixth day began with rain. Heavy, cold rain fell in sheets, turning the ground around the Merriman house into dark mud. The sky was the color of lead, and the air hummed with the kind of pressure that made everything feel too close, too tense. By now, the three men were hardly speaking. They worked in silence, each caught in his own uneasy thoughts. The house felt different, more awake somehow. The floors moaned with every step. The walls seemed to breathe. The longer they stayed, the more the air inside pressed against their chests. Frank hadn't slept the night before. He sat awake by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers, replaying the moment he'd seen the bones in his mind. He told himself it didn't matter, that they were old, that it wasn't their business. But the thought kept gnawing at him. He had seen children die in war, but this was something else. It was a quiet death, hidden, forgotten. Tom, meanwhile, was unraveling faster. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His hands shook constantly, and his eyes darted around like a man hearing things no one else could. He swore he'd seen a child's face in one of the upstairs windows the night before, smiling faintly before vanishing. When he told Frank, the older man barked at him to stop. But he didn't stop seeing things. Eddie had changed, too. The curious spark that once made him dig into the past had turned into an obsession. He carried the wooden horse everywhere now, his thumb rubbing against its rough edges like a nervous habit. Sometimes he'd whispered to it under his breath, calling it Henry, calling it boy. He spent hours sitting by the cellar door, listening to why mid-afternoon, the storm outside grew worse. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled low over the hills. The men were inside, trying to finish boarding up the front room, when the power went out. The lantern flickered, then went dark, leaving them in a thick, swallowing blackness. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the noise. A slow, dragging sound from the upstairs hall, like something being pulled across the floor. Eddie froze. Tom's breathing quickened. Frank picked up the lantern and tried to relight it, but his hands shook too much. Rats, Frank said quietly. Big ones. But they all knew it wasn't rats. The sound wasn't fast or panicked. It was steady, deliberate, almost human. Someone's up there, Eddie whispered. Frank's jaw tightened. No one's up there. Still, he took his flashlight and started toward the stairs. The beam shook across the walls, catching glimpses of peeling wallpaper and dust floating in the air. Each step creaked under his boots. Eddie followed, clutching the wooden horse to his chest. Tom stayed near the door, muttering to himself. When Frank reached the landing, he saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door was half open. The light from his flashlight glinted off something wet near the floor. He stepped closer, heart pounding. It wasn't water. It was dark, thick, and spreading slowly. A line of blood snaking from under the door. "Tom," he shouted. "Get up here." Tom didn't move. He just shook his head violently, eyes wide. Frank kicked the door open. Inside was the old nursery, long forgotten, the wallpaper faded with tiny stars and moons. The smell hit him first, rot and iron. In the corner stood a cradle. It rocked slightly on its own, creaking with each movement. When the flashlight beam landed on it, Frank stopped breathing. Inside the cradle, wrapped in the same cloth they'd seen before, was a small skeleton. The bones were clean, arranged perfectly like someone had cared for them, even in death. Eddie stepped closer, trembling. "It's them," he whispered. "The Merriman children." Frank turned sharply. "We're leaving. Now." But Eddie didn't move. His face had gone pale, eyes wide with something between awe and madness. "You don't get it, Frank. He didn't kill them. He was trying to save them. It's in the papers, his notes. He thought he could bring them back." "Stop it," Frank snapped. "We're done here." Eddie clutched the cradle's edge, his voice cracking. He wasn't evil. He was a father trying to fix what God broke. Something inside Frank snapped then. All the fear, the exhaustion, the anger at being in that cursed house boiled over. He grabbed Eddie's arm and yanked him away. "You've lost your damn mind," he shouted. "We dig up graves, we find bones, and you want to make excuses for it?" Eddie jerked back, pushing him. "You don't understand. They're still here." The cradle suddenly stopped rocking. The silence that followed was deep and cold. Then came a faint sound of whispering, so soft. It was almost beneath hearing. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. Tom stumbled into the room, eyes wild. "It's her," he gasped. "The woman in the picture. She's here." Lightning flashed through the window, and for a split second, they all saw it. Something standing behind them in the reflection of the cracked mirror on the wall. A woman in a torn white dress, her face half-shadowed, her eyes hollow and black. The next second, the lantern crashed to the floor, shattering. The room went dark. Frank felt something cold brush past him, and he swung blindly. Eddie screamed. There was the sound of struggle, heavy breathing, a thud, a sharp crack. When the light from a fallen lantern flickered back to life, Eddie was on the floor, his head bleeding, the wooden horse splintered beside him. Frank stood over him, panting, his hands shaking. Tom stared in shock. "What did you do?" Frank looked down at his own hands, red with blood. "He came at me," he muttered. He tried to, but the words wouldn't come. Eddie wasn't moving. His eyes were open, glassy. The whispering had stopped. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the rain outside filled the silence. Pounding against the windows like fists, Tom backed away slowly. "We have to call someone," he said. "We can't just leave him." Frank shook his head. "No one will believe us." "You think anyone's going to buy this?" 3 men in a haunted house, and one ends up dead. He was breathing hard, pacing. "We cover it. Say he fell. Say it was an accident." Tom stared at him, horrified. "You're out of your mind. Do you want to go to prison?" Frank snapped. "We got his blood on our hands, Tom. We have to finish this." He dragged Eddie's body toward the cellar door. Tom tried to stop him, but Frank's strength was different now. Desperate, wild. "We'll bury him where the others were," Frank said through gritted teeth. "He won't be alone." Tom screamed at him to stop, but the thunder swallowed his voice. Down in the cellar, the lantern light barely reached the floor. Frank dug fast, shoveling wet dirt with trembling hands, his breath ragged. The smell was unbearable now, thick and sour. He could hear Tom crying behind him, muttering prayers. When Frank dropped Eddie's body into the shallow pit, something inside him broke. He stared down at the face of his friend and whispered, "I'm sorry." But then, from the shadows, came a sound, a soft creak like the cradle upstairs. Both men froze. Slowly, Frank lifted his head. There, just beyond the light, something moved. Small figures, shifting in the dark, pale and silent. The air grew colder. Tom turned and bolted up the stairs, screaming. Frank stood there, unable to move, his body locked by terror. The figures stopped moving, and one of them whispered, barely audible, "Stay." Frank stumbled back, tripping over the dirt. He ran after Tom, his heart pounding, his mind breaking. Upstairs, Tom had made it to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wood swelled with rain, trapping them inside. He pounded on it, screaming, as Frank reached him. The house groaned. Then, without warning, the chandelier above them came crashing down. Frank was thrown back, glass cutting into his arms. Tom was pinned under the weight, his body twisted, the light from the storm flashing over his face. He gasped once, then went still. The rain slowed. The thunder rolled away. And in the sudden, suffocating silence, Frank realized he was the only one left alive, that he stumbled through the wreckage, out the back door, into the wet field. The air outside felt thin, unreal. He turned back once, staring at the old Merriman house, its windows glowing faintly, as if lit from within. For a moment, he thought he saw the woman again, standing in the upstairs window, holding the cradle in her arms. Then the light went out. Frank kept walking until his legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the mud, the rain washing the blood from his hands. He stayed there until morning, silent, broken, and certain that whatever evil had lived in that house now lived inside him too. When dawn came, the storm had passed, but the Merriman house stood in a strange stillness, as though time itself had stopped to take a breath. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, the kind that lingers after something is burned. Not a fire, but something deeper, something human. Frank Dillard sat at the edge of the field, his clothes soaked through, mud up to his knees. He hadn't moved since the rain stopped. His eyes were open, but they didn't see anything. His hands still trembled, though the blood on them had long been washed away. The town found him there hours later. A passing farmer spotted the figure sitting motionless near the property and sent for the sheriff. When they arrived, Frank didn't fight or speak. He just looked toward the house and muttered one thing. Over and over, "We woke them up." Inside, the scene was a nightmare. 2 men dead, Eddie in the cellar, half buried in the dirt, and Tom crushed under the fallen chandelier. The police couldn't make sense of it. There were no signs of a struggle with outsiders, no forced entry, no robbery. Just 3 men who'd gone into an old abandoned house, and only one walked out alive. That Frank's statement didn't help. He spoke in fragments, repeating that the house didn't want them there, that the children wouldn't rest. The sheriff, a hard man named Carter Hensley, tried to get straight answers. "You expect me to write that ghosts killed your friends?" he asked sharply. Frank didn't respond. He just stared at his hands and whispered, "I killed them by staying." He was taken into custody that same day. The news spread through the small Vermont town like wildfire. Everyone knew Frank Dillard, the quiet veteran who'd returned from the war and tried to rebuild a normal life. He was respected, trusted. To hear that he'd killed 2 men in cold blood inside the Merriman place, it didn't fit. Some said the war had finally broken his mind. Others said the house itself was cursed, that it had claimed more lives to keep it secret at the coroner's office. The findings made things even stranger. Eddie's cause of death was blunt force trauma, consistent with a blow to the head, likely from a tool or lantern. Tom's death was accidental, crushed by falling debris. No sign of foul play beyond that. But when they examined Eddie's body further, they found something unusual, faint bruising around his neck, as though someone, or something, had gripped him their BF. Or he fell. The police chalked it up to panic and violence between desperate men. The official story was simple. 3 workers in a rotting house, tempers flaring, tragedy following. No one questioned it too much. People in town didn't want to talk about the Merriman house anyway. They were just glad it was over. But it wasn't over for Frank. He was held in the county jail, waiting for trial, though the doctors soon claimed he wasn't fit to stand before a judge. They said his mind was fractured, that he was haunted by what he'd done. He'd wake up screaming, saying he could hear children crying through the walls. Sometimes he'd laugh quietly for no reason, staring at the empty corner of his cell. When they asked what he saw, he said, "The mother's holding them now. They're quiet again." They transferred him to a state asylum by winter. His sister came once to visit, but she left in tears after he asked if she could hear the singing. He never had another visitor. The town tried to move on. The property was sealed off, the council declaring it unsafe for habitation. But rumors spread fast. Children dared each other to run up and touch the front porch. People said that if you stood close enough to the cellar window at night, you could see a flicker of light inside. Some said it was just reflections. Others weren't so sure. For the families of Tom and Eddie, grief settled like fog. Tom's wife refused to believe it was an accident. She said her husband had written her the night before he died, saying he was afraid of Frank, that he wanted to quit the job but felt trapped by the promise of payment. Eddie's younger brother, on the other hand, defended Frank fiercely. He said Eddie had been acting strangely for weeks, obsessed with the house and the story inside it. He believed Frank's story, that something inside that place had driven them mad. The town was split in opinion. Some saw Frank as a murderer who'd lost control. Others saw him as a victim of something darker, an unseen force that the Merriman family had left behind. Months passed. Winter came, then spring. Snow covered the Merriman house, muting its presence. No one dared enter it again. not even the sheriff. The council quietly stopped mentioning plans to sell the property. It stood empty, its broken windows staring out like hollow eyes in the asylum. Frank's condition worsened. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking altogether, except for one phrase that nurses said he whispered whenever the lights went out. Don't let them dig again. His body grew thin, frail, until one morning, he simply didn't wake up. When they cleaned his cell, they found something strange beneath his mattress, a crude carving on the wooden frame. It was a small horse, scratched deep into the wood. Frank was buried in the town's cemetery beside his parents, his grave unmarked by request of his only living relative. Few attended the burial. The priest who said the final words avoided mentioning the house, but death didn't silence the story. Within months, the newspapers picked it up again, calling it the house that drove 3 men mad. Reporters from Boston and New York came through, digging for angles, printing sensational headlines. They called Frank the haunted cleaner. Some went as far as to claim the Merriman family's spirits had possessed him. The townspeople hated the attention. For them, it wasn't a ghost story. It was a tragedy that stole 3 men who never should have gone near that house. Still, stories have a way of spreading, especially when they carry mystery and fear. By the end of that year, the Merriman House was infamous. Travelers stopped by to take photos. Teenagers dared each other to go inside, and almost came back laughing. Every once in a while, someone didn't. Tools would go missing. Doors would slam. Once a group of boys swore they saw footprints in the dust leading to the nursery. Small footprints, like a child's. The sheriff eventually boarded the house up completely, nailing the doors shut and marking the property as condemned. But even he admitted to hearing strange noises one night while patrolling nearby. Like singing, he said quietly, but soft like a lullaby. In time, the house faded back into silence. The world moved on. New families came to the town, and new stories replaced old ones. But for the few who still remembered Frank, Eddie, and Tom, there remained a question no one could answer. What really happened in that house? Was it madness, guilt, or something far beyond human understanding? Years later, when the town's records were being digitized, a clerk came across a file from the Merriman estate. Inside were old documents, bank receipts, deeds, and one handwritten letter from Henry Merriman dated 1850. It was short, almost desperate. If I fail, they will remain between this world and the next. Forgive me. I only wanted to keep them safe. The clerk didn't know what to do with it. He placed it back in the file and returned it to storage. But that night, driving home, he swore he saw a faint light flicker in the distance near Black Creek Road, coming from the windows of a hoe. No one had lived in for 70 years. And though the town had long stopped talking about it, those who passed by on stormy nights said the same thing. Sometimes, if you listened closely through the wind, you could still hear the creak of a cradle. Years after the Merriman tragedy, the story had settled into the soil of the town, half memory, half myth. Time, as it often does, softened the sharper edges, but it never erased the stain. People still spoke of it in lowered voices, not out of superstition, but out of respect. The Merriman House stood as a relic of everything the town wanted to forget and couldn't. Frank Dillard's death marked the quiet end of the legal case. With no surviving defendants and no clear evidence of murder, the state closed the file, calling it an unexplained domestic incident resulting in multiple fatalities. It was an unsatisfying conclusion. Neither guilt nor innocence formally declared. The courts had no place for what couldn't be proven, and the law has no language for ghosts. For those who lived through it, justice was a word that lost meaning. Tom's widow never remarried. She lived in the same small house until her death, the curtains always drawn, her son growing up with the shadow of his father's name. Eddie's brother left town altogether, unable to stand the gossip and the half-whispered condolences that filled every corner of the diner, every church PEWAS for the town. The Merriman case left a scar deeper than most would admit. It wasn't just about 3 men who died. It was about what they'd unearthed or thought they'd unearthed inside that decaying mansion. Their story became a mirror, reflecting back the quiet dread that people carried in their own hearts, the knowledge that some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. When the asylum released Frank's medical records posthumously, the details shocked even those who had doubted him. The notes described vivid hallucinations consistent with extreme trauma, visions of children laughing, voices in the dark, a woman's lullaby echoing through the night. The doctors labeled it delusional guilt psychosis, the mind's way of manufacturing punishment when the conscience cannot bear what it's done. Yet, one nurse's entry stood out. It read, "He claims they only appear when he stops believing he's guilty." It raised an uncomfortable question. Was Frank tormented by madness, or by something he could not explain away? In the years that followed, those who had known Frank spoke of him differently. The narrative shifted from villain to victim, from madman to martyr. The local paper printed an anniversary column years later titled, "The Man Who Heard the Past," suggesting that Frank's so-called delusions were perhaps rooted in something real. But for Frank, justice, if it ever existed, was a thing beyond reach. His life ended in isolation, haunted by visions that blurred the line between guilt and truth. Tom and Eddie found no peace either. Their names were reduced to footnotes in a tragedy too strange to categorize. Their families carried the weight in silence, and the town carried the shame of what it ignored. The warnings, the rumors, the knowledge that something was wrong long before the final night. If there was a transformation, it came not from redemption, but from resignation. The people of Black Hollow learned to live with unanswered questions. They rebuilt their lives around the void left by what they could not understand. What happened to the Merriman House reached beyond a single event. It revealed a quiet truth about the human condition. That fear and curiosity often walk hand in hand, and that the search for meaning can destroy as much as it enlightens. The Merriman case became a cautionary tale. Scholars later cited it in lectures about collective hysteria and the psychological weight of isolation. The asylum doctors argued it was proof of how guilt manifests as shared delusion. Paranormal investigators saw it as evidence that trauma could awaken something in a place, a kind of echo that never fades. For the community, the story highlighted deeper societal fractures. How quickly a town can turn on its own. How easily sympathy can become suspicion. When Frank first returned from the war, the town had called him a hero. After the Merriman House, they called him a killer. And only when he was dead did they start to wonder if they'd been wrong all along. IT showed how fragile reputation is, how easily public perception bends beneath the weight of fear. The media's sensational retellings didn't help. By the time city reporters were done, the truth had become entertainment, and the pain of the victims had become ghost stories for profit. The moral complexity of the real people, their doubts, loyalties, regrets, was stripped away for a headline that I end this way. The tragedy revealed more about society than it did about the supernatural. A hunger for spectacle, a discomfort with ambiguity, and a refusal to accept that some mysteries are simply unsolvable to its heart. The Merriman case was never just about death. It was about conscience. Each man who entered that house carried a reason: money, curiosity, desperation. They thought they could control what they didn't understand, exploit a story, and leave it untouched. But the house, whether haunted or symbolic, forced them to confront their own moral decay. Frank, in his final days, became the embodiment of a man crushed beneath moral consequence. His descent wasn't into madness. It was into the full awareness of his own guilt. Whether he'd struck the fatal blow or not, he believed himself responsible, and that belief consumed him. That is the true horror of conscience. It doesn't need proof to punish. Tom's ambition and Eddie's greed became reflections of society's quiet sins. The urge to take without thought, to uncover without understanding. Each man mirrored a different flaw of human behavior: denial, arrogance, and obsession. Together, they illustrated that evil doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it's drawn out from within by fear, envy, or pride. And perhaps that's what the Merriman House represented. Not a literal haunting, but the embodiment of guilt left unchecked. Every whisper in its walls, every creak in its floorboards, was the sound of humanity wrestling with its own conscience. In the decades since, The Merriman House has decayed further, collapsing under the weight of time. Its windows are boarded, its rooms filled with dust. But those who stand near it dusk say the air still feels heavy, as if the walls remember. It has become both monument and warning, a reminder that some places are not cursed by spirits, but by the choices made within them. Frank Dillard's name, once infamous, now stirs quiet sympathy. His story has become a lens through which people examine their own capacity for fear, faith, and forgiveness. The law couldn't deliver justice for him because justice, in this case, had no clear shape. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about understanding. And that, perhaps, is the tragedy, that the truth died with the last man who might have known it. In the end, the Merriman case stands as a haunting lesson on the frailty of human morality. It shows that guilt can outlive punishment, that some crimes are committed not by the hands that strike, but by the hearts that look away. The world remembers it as a ghost story. But those who listen closely know better. It was never about ghosts at all. It was about people, and what happens when they dig too deep into the darkness, only to find themselves staring back.